Welcome to another Heroes and Bosses video. This episode is all about wet palettes, how to make one, the science behind how they work, and the pros and cons of using one. I use a wet palette nearly exclusively unless I'm doing something with pre-made washes like Agrax Earthshade or from dry brushing. So to start off, I'm going to show you how to make a very cheap and easy wet palette. To do this, you're going to need three things: a sandwich-sized Tupperware container, parchment paper, and a roll of paper towel. First, I'm going to roll out the parchment paper to a width that's the same width as my Tupperware. I'll just cut that off and then take that piece and cut it into three equal-sized pieces. Now each of these pieces is pretty much perfectly square and will fit nicely into the Tupperware. So now we need something that's going to absorb the water. If you can find a thin sheet of sponge, that'll create a much flatter surface for your wet palette, but this is the cheap and easy version, so I'm using paper towel. I find the best paper towel to use is the kind that comes in half sheets, because when you fold it in half, it fits almost perfectly into the Tupperware. Next, take your Tupperware to a sink and get the paper towel wet. You don't want excess water on the bottom, that's why I'm adding the water slowly, but if there is, just tip up the Tupperware and drain it off. The last step is to take one of your squares of parchment paper and flatten it out onto the paper towel. It doesn't matter which side is up. Once the paper towel is wet, it will flatten itself out. And that's all there is to it. Your wet palette is now ready for paint. Now for the next part, I'm going to explain exactly how wet palettes work on a molecular level. This is something I've never seen anyone else explain before, probably because you don't really need to know it, but I think it's pretty cool. So if we could zoom in on the parchment paper, we'd see that it's covered in very tiny holes. That means that some molecules can pass through it, but not others. Water, for instance, is a very small molecule, and it can, very slowly, move through the parchment paper. Pigment molecules, on the other hand, are quite large. They're too big to fit through the holes in parchment paper. That's why you'll never see paint stains on your paper towel or your sponge underneath. Now imagine this is a side view of your wet palette. When you have a dab of paint sitting on it, water molecules are constantly evaporating into the air, drying out your paint. But underneath the paint, you have water molecules diffusing into your paint at pretty much the exact same rate. So even if you don't cover up the wet palette, your paint will stay at the same consistency for hours. So for the last part of this video, I want to talk about the pros and cons of the wet palette. First and foremost is that you save a lot of money on paint, and as we all know, paint is not cheap. As I said before, I don't use a wet palette for dry brushing or with washes. I use one of these palettes, but I'll be damned if I'm ever going to clean one of these things. I mean, look at how easy cleanup is with a homemade wet palette. Throw another bit of paper towel and parchment paper in there and you're good to go. Another benefit of a wet palette is that you can work with really small amounts of paint. This would dry out in about a minute on a regular palette, but on a covered wet palette, this paint will never dry out. And finally, it's really good for letting you play around with mixing colors. And if you're painting a miniature with mixed colors, sometimes it's really hard to reproduce a color that you've created, unless you have the paint left over on your wet palette from the previous day of painting. The only cons I can think of for a homemade wet palette is that the paper towel isn't going to be perfectly flat, so you will get wrinkles in your paper like this. Also, the lip of a sandwich container is quite a bit higher than a professional wet palette, so you'll need to reach up higher with your hand to get your brush into the palette. So that's it for my info session on wet palettes. If you've never used one, I strongly recommend that you make one and give it a try. It's pretty cheap to make, and it could be a game changer in your painting. That's it for now. I hope you found this video useful, and as always, thank you for watching.